The entire mansion fell silent every evening at exactly 7 o'clock. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers, expensive dishes filled the dining table, and servants stood perfectly still, waiting for another meal to end the same way it had for months. The elderly woman at the head of the table would simply stare at the food with empty eyes before asking to be taken back to her room without touching a single bite. Doctors had failed. Specialists had failed. Therapists had failed. But everything changed the night the family's newly hired cook ignored every unwritten rule in the house and placed a simple homemade dinner directly in front of the millionaire's mother while his elegant wife watched in stunned silence. Within seconds, tears filled the old woman's eyes, and for the first time in months, she lifted a spoon. Before we continue, if you believe kindness, compassion, and second chances can change lives, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that remind us humanity still exists. The story began in Charleston, South Carolina, where millionaire Jonathan Carter owned one of the most beautiful estates in the city. His success had come from years of building a nationwide construction company after inheriting almost nothing except determination from his late father. People admired Jonathan's business achievements, but very few knew that behind the luxurious gates of Carter Manor, happiness had quietly disappeared. His 79-year-old mother, Margaret Carter, had stopped eating nearly 6 months earlier after the death of her husband of 54 years. She wasn't physically unable to eat. She simply refused. Every meal reminded her of the man who had always sat beside her, held her hand, and thanked her before taking the first bite. Without him, food had become another painful reminder that love could disappear overnight. Jonathan spared no expense trying to save her. The best physicians in New York, Boston, and Chicago examined Margaret. Nutritionists prepared personalized menus. Therapists spent hours encouraging her to reconnect with life. Every recommendation was followed, every prescription filled, every specialist paid generously. Yet every evening ended with untouched plates being carried back to the kitchen. Slowly, Margaret became weaker. Her smile disappeared, her voice grew softer, and even walking across the room became exhausting. Jonathan's wife, Victoria Carter, believed she was doing everything correctly. Elegant meals were served exactly as nutritionists instructed. Imported ingredients arrived daily from the finest markets. Every dinner looked worthy of a luxury magazine. But something invisible remained missing. Victoria viewed every meal as another task to complete, another problem to solve efficiently. She measured success by appearance instead of emotion, never realizing that grief could never be healed by perfection alone. One rainy afternoon, the family's longtime housekeeper announced that their previous cook had retired unexpectedly because of health problems. Jonathan approved hiring a replacement immediately. Among dozens of applicants arrived a quiet woman named Grace Sullivan, a 46-year-old widow from rural Tennessee who had spent years cooking in churches, community shelters, and family-owned restaurants across the southern United States. Her resume seemed ordinary compared with professional chefs trained in Europe. Yet there was something peaceful about the way she described food. She never mentioned recipes first. She spoke about memories, comfort, and bringing people together around a table. Grace noticed something unusual during her first week. Every evening, dozens of expensive dishes were prepared only to return untouched. The servants accepted this as normal, but Grace could not understand why no one ever asked Margaret what she actually wanted. She quietly spoke with older staff members, learning about Margaret's life before wealth arrived. She discovered that decades earlier, Margaret had lived on a small farm where she cooked simple meals using vegetables from the garden, homemade bread, chicken soup, and slow-cooked beef stew. Her late husband had always praised her cooking, even during years when they could barely afford groceries. Grace also noticed something else. Margaret spent hours looking through an old photo album. Hidden between the photographs was a faded handwritten recipe card stained by decades of use. It contained Margaret's favorite chicken and vegetable soup recipe written in her own handwriting many years earlier. Without asking permission, Grace woke before sunrise the next morning. She visited a local farmer's market instead of the expensive gourmet suppliers. She bought fresh carrots, onions, celery, herbs, homemade bread, and a free-range chicken. She cooked slowly throughout the afternoon, filling the mansion with a rich aroma that had not existed there for years. Several servants quietly smiled because the smell reminded them of their own childhood homes. That evening, Victoria entered the dining room expecting another elaborate presentation prepared according to expensive dietary plans. Instead, she froze. Grace carried a simple white bowl of homemade soup, warm bread with butter, and herbal tea. There were no decorations, no luxury ingredients, and no artistic presentation. It looked like something prepared by a loving mother rather than a five-star restaurant. Victoria immediately questioned Grace's decision, believing the carefully designed medical menu had been ignored. Before anyone could stop her, Grace gently placed the bowl in front of Margaret. The elderly woman stared at the soup without moving. The room became completely silent. Then Margaret slowly closed her eyes. The aroma carried her backward through decades of memories. She remembered cold winter evenings beside a fireplace, her husband removing his work boots after long days, their children laughing around a small wooden table, and simple dinners filled with gratitude instead of wealth. Tears rolled gently down her cheeks. Her trembling hands reached for the spoon almost automatically. Everyone watched in disbelief. Margaret took one small bite. Then another. And another. Within minutes, the bowl was empty. Several servants quietly wiped tears from their own faces. Jonathan stood frozen, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. For the first time in 6 months, his mother had eaten an entire meal. The following days brought remarkable changes. Grace never forced Margaret to eat. Instead, she spent time listening to stories about her childhood, her marriage, and the years before success transformed their lives. Every meal became connected to a memory. Fresh biscuits reminded Margaret of Sunday mornings. Apple pie reminded her of county fairs. Vegetable stew reminded her of rainy evenings when electricity sometimes failed, forcing the family to eat by candlelight while laughing together. Little by little, Margaret began requesting specific meals instead of refusing them. Her strength slowly returned. She started walking through the garden again, greeting gardeners by name and sitting outside beneath the old oak tree where her husband had once read newspapers every morning. Jonathan could hardly recognize the transformation. For months he had believed expensive treatment was the only solution. Watching Grace quietly restore his mother's appetite made him realize that loneliness had never been cured because everyone had focused on her body while forgetting her heart. Victoria struggled the most with this realization. At first, embarrassment turned into defensiveness. She convinced herself Grace had simply been lucky. But as days passed, she observed how naturally Margaret smiled whenever Grace entered the room. She noticed Grace sitting beside her after dinner, never rushing away, never checking a schedule, simply listening. One afternoon Victoria discovered Margaret and Grace baking bread together in the kitchen. Flour covered the countertops, both women laughed like old friends, and the expensive dining room stood completely empty. For the first time, Victoria understood something painful. She had spent years trying to impress the family instead of truly knowing them. Ashamed, Victoria quietly asked Grace how she had accomplished what doctors and specialists could not. Grace answered with gentle honesty. She explained that hungry hearts often refuse food because they are starving for something deeper than nutrition. People grieving profound loss rarely need perfection. They need familiarity, patience, memories, and someone willing to see the person behind the pain. Those words changed Victoria forever. Instead of competing with Grace, she began learning from her. She joined Margaret during afternoon tea, asked about old family traditions, and listened without interrupting. She stopped ordering expensive meals simply to display elegance. She learned Margaret's recipes, wrote them down carefully, and cooked beside Grace every weekend. Months later, Jonathan organized a family dinner unlike any held before. There were no famous chefs, no imported delicacies, and no elaborate decorations. Every dish came from Margaret's handwritten recipes. Children, grandchildren, neighbors, and longtime employees all shared one long table in the garden. Margaret looked around with joyful eyes as laughter filled the evening air. She quietly admitted that she had not simply lost her appetite after her husband's passing. She had lost the feeling that home still existed. Grace had reminded her that home was never a building or a fortune. Home was the love shared around an ordinary table. Jonathan established a charitable foundation in Grace's honor, supporting meal programs for grieving seniors living alone throughout the United States. Thousands of elderly people eventually received warm homemade meals prepared with compassion rather than convenience. Grace insisted the program include volunteers who would sit and eat with them because no one should have to face loneliness alone. The mansion became known not for its luxury but for its welcoming kitchen. Employees often said the richest room in the house was no longer Jonathan's office but the place where bread baked slowly every morning and stories were shared without hurry. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe for more emotional stories that celebrate kindness, hope, and the power of compassion. Before we end, tell us in the comments, what simple meal reminds you most of someone you deeply love or miss? As the sun disappeared behind the old oak tree, Margaret quietly enjoyed another bowl of homemade soup while her family laughed nearby. Wealth had purchased every luxury imaginable, yet it was the kindness of one ordinary cook that restored what millions of dollars never could, a mother's appetite, a family's broken bond, and the comforting reminder that the greatest healing often begins with a single meal served with love.